how are you holding the complexity of the world right now? Just a nice, light question to end August with. How are you holding the complexity of the world right now? Enjoy. Welcome back, New Abbey, from your Zoom groups. This is one of those weeks where I feel the complexity of the world that's going on, that there's all kinds of things taking place within our culture. There's been 2020, which has been a year of a pandemic, this unprecedented reality that we're all experiencing corporately. And maybe for the first time in human history, wherever you are, whoever you are, you're experiencing a similar reality. There's an uncomfortability that's taking place where we're raw, where we're figuring it out, where we don't actually have great answers about how to move forward as we wait in anticipation for some type of vaccine. That there's natural disasters that are going on. Within California, we have fires that are everywhere. There's 2 hurricanes that have moved through the Gulf, through Louisiana, and through Texas. That it's been a year of social justice as we've seen continued killings of black people within our country, recognizing that we have still yet to reconcile the racism that has been a part of our 400-year history, and that there's a need for repair and wholeness moving forward. That this week, Chadwick Boseman and his death, and a representative of a community, and the pain that we experience corporately as great leaders and great influencers pass away. That here within Pasadena, the shooting of Anthony McLean. That in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just a week ago, Jacob Blake and his death. And then the aftermath of what's continued with that. That a man during a potential domestic kind of situation can be shot in the back by a police officer 7 times, but a 17-year-old kid carrying a semi-automatic weapon can kill people in the middle of the streets. That our country is divided. That we don't have good solutions or answers, and we are unable to live in a place of repair and restoration. And I think what we desire at the end of the day is all of the same things. There's not a human being that I know in the world who doesn't want a safe home to live in, who doesn't want a safe community where their kids can go out and play. There's not a human being who doesn't long for stable economics so that they can enjoy the fruits of their labor and the opportunities that they've been given. There's not a human being who doesn't desire for healthy civic officers who protect and care for all people equally, that they're there to support you, not to kill you. There's not people in the world who don't desire a government who wouldn't act as some type of safety net for those moments that things don't work out for you. There's no human being in the world who doesn't desire love and care and to be known and to be accepted. That we all desire the same things. We all long for the same trajectory as human beings. And if we could sit in that reality, which is a path of maturity, if we could say, every other human being wants the same things that I want. We go about it in different paths at times. We have different ideologies and different beliefs, and we come from diverse experiences and homes and cultures, but we're all human. That we're all made in the image of God, that we're all made in the likeness of God, that we can recognize that if I'm experiencing this because I want it, wouldn't I have the capacity for compassion, for empathy, for kindness to say, there's a whole group of people over here who are saying, I want the same thing that you want. Why would I be angry at that? Why would I want to get in the way of that? Why would I not fight for that? They're not asking for anything different than the things that I want. How would we live in a place of unity and listening and compromise, maybe even sacrifice, knowing that every brother and sister that we have wants the exact same thing that we do? Why would we fight that? That is the end goal. That we all long for the same maturity. We all long for the same hope. And yet we live in a world where somehow we ridicule that. That it was painful this week to read things on the internet as the Milwaukee Bucks led the way across the NBA and then eventually across all of sports, where sports shut down for a day to say this, that with so many black athletes who entertain Americans all of the time, saying things like, if you can't hear us, why should you see us? Why should we entertain you on your televisions if you can't see the fact that you're killing us in the streets? And that we have the leadership of the Milwaukee Bucks and the LeBron Jameses and these people with big voices. And then when I read the comments online of people filled with so much hate, of saying, well, if he wouldn't have resisted arrest, then I could be watching an NBA game today. Really? Really? That human being wants the same thing that you want. I've been a pastor for 12 years. I've walked into many scenarios in people's homes. I remember as a young 23-year-old pastor, I was invited into a home, and it was the perfect family that you can imagine. They're like homeschooling their kids, and there's like 12 of them, I think, something like that. And I get invited over, and there's a chair through the wall. That the father had lost his temper, the wife was scared, the children were scared, they called a pastor over. And that's one of those moments where you might call the police because somebody is so worked up, so agitated, so angry that you might need support beyond yourself. But what I would never imagine is that for this family living in that suburban neighborhood, that when the police would come, that if you couldn't somehow calm down, that you would be killed. And that when we have this language for people of, oh, well, you know, if you wouldn't resist it, if you resist, you shouldn't be killed. If you're a criminal, you shouldn't be killed. Based on the color of your skin, you shouldn't be killed. There's no reason that somebody should be killed by police officers if you are not about to kill somebody else. And even that, we have not learned how to de-escalate. That the message that we keep talking about week after week is not one that is ethereal. It is simply every single human being is made in the image and the likeness of God. And those with power should use that power to preserve the image and likeness of God, not to deteriorate it. And we use language and culture all the time where we devalue human beings and we set up all these caveats that somehow make it okay. It's never okay. It is never okay that a human life should be taken. And I want to hold that complexity this morning as we continue our series in How Does the Bible Work? Because the Bible was not made so that we can memorize more Bible verses. The Bible was not made so that you could memorize little sound bites and sound more Christian or theological. The scriptures were provided as an opportunity for us to grow up. To say, these words are true, this is the word of God, or this is holy because it's true in every generation. There's truth here that continues to work for human beings regardless of where you find yourself. That the work of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself is the endless work for all of humanity. That this work of even being able to love your enemies is the very heartbeat of who Jesus is. That the scripture pointing us towards that. They are not ideologies and beliefs to be memorized. They are practices to be lived out. So we cannot say with one side of our mouth, praise and worship songs to God, which I was about to say WAP, and I did because that's something completely different. But side note, anyone heard this song? It's just absolutely wild, right? I'm a dad, so I'm just like, what's even happening here? Great, okay, someone put it online, and they put WAP as worship and praise, and that really triggered my brain there. And if you don't know what that is, do not Google image it. Great, okay, well, we're moving on. We can't, out of one side of our mouth, continue with worship and praise and memorizing Bible verses, but then somehow be okay with inequality and inequity in our society. Jesus would never be okay with that. How do I know that? Jesus died for that. Jesus went up against the most powerful system of his day to say that this type of oppression is not okay, and that even this oppressive system, although it may try to take your life, will not, that there will always be resurrection for those who would die to themselves. That's where they'll find their lives. Those with power, would you use your power for powerlessness to provide life for other people? That's the good news that we live into in this complexity with Jesus, that the scriptures are leading us to this reality. And so we finish our series in How Does the Bible Work by looking at the life of Paul. And for many people that I know, Paul is fascinating, to say the least. Paul is somebody who's been used to be weaponized a lot of times throughout the history of the church. And what I want to do is humanize Paul in a different way. So if we're going to talk about Paul, what we're going to talk about is this reality that all of humanity is evolving. And the point of our evolution is to evolve towards maturity. Because the maturity that we all desire is that we desire a world where every human being is known and loved and accepted. We all want the same thing. So if we can agree where we're going, then maybe we can put some practices in place that would allow every single human being to get there. So to talk about these things, follow along with me. We're going to talk about being only human. That's a little nod to the Jonas Brothers. Am I right? Anybody? No? Great. Then if we're going to talk about only human, then we're going to talk about being paradoxical. If you can talk about being paradoxical, then we're going to talk about being complicated. And if we can talk about being complicated, then, of course, a little Twitter moment for you, my friends. And Twitter will lead us to 23 and 24. And then we're going to deconstruct some things and reconstruct some things because this is an endless process in life. It's not just something that happens one time. And if we're going to really reconstruct well, then we're going to be gracious to ourselves and to some other people that this process takes time. And if it's going to take time for us, then maybe it's going to take time for some others as well. If we can understand the time that it takes, then we can name our Jerusalem. Then we can step into some deeper evolution. And if we can do all of these things, then like any good, mature human being, then maybe we'll be able to cross the street. Let's go. One of the things that people have a difficult time with, particularly within evangelicalism and Protestantism, or really Christianity within the West, is that the majority of the way that we've understood the Bible is that the Bible is the Word of God, it's all divine, and again, somehow it was made perfectly in some vacuum and then handed to the early church in a perfectly cleaned up Microsoft Word document. And it was not. The Bible is something that evolved over 700 years with hundreds of people's input, and it touched and experienced all kinds of different cultures. And there was prayer and thoughtfulness, and there was books that were left out. There were books that are added in. The process of how the scriptures were made is incredibly fascinating. For the scriptures that we have, like Paul, one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament, sometimes we think that Paul somehow knew that Paul was writing the Bible. Paul did not know that Paul was writing the Bible. He was not sitting there in those early years thinking, this will be the King James Version. How art thou? No, that is not what Paul was doing. Paul happened to be an educated person in first century who had the ability to read and write. So we have the words and experiences of Paul because he had enough privilege to be educated. So he was able to share his narrative with the church. Was God doing something with Paul? Was Paul called? Did Paul experience the risen Christ? Of course. But it's not all divine. It's not all a perfect story. More importantly, what it is it's a human story. Paul was simply a human being trying to figure it out. Paul's ministry, his writings, his letters come over decades of time. It's over these decades of time that Paul thinks and experiences different things about God and about humanity. And the challenge of Paul is if you've read Paul, you may read him, and I often read Paul as a young person and thought, this guy's an asshole. I don't know if you've ever read him and thought that. He's like insecure. He's clearly got some ego issues. Man, he's trying to prove himself. If he was a guy living now, he's like probably like, driving a big truck, trying to he's doing something, right? Trying to prove himself in some way, and that's okay. I think it's beautiful that we see that in Paul. He wasn't some perfect leader who was floating around. He was somebody who was evolving in real time like everybody else. And if we can recognize that Paul was just a human being, then we can begin to embrace the reality that Paul was paradoxical. That Paul, like all of us, had competing beliefs, systems, ideologies, and cultural events that were shaping who he was as a human being. That Paul was a good Jew. And the Bible, if you remember, was written by Jews for Jews. Even the earliest Christians were all Jewish. Later on, we'll write stuff for the Gentiles, but all of it comes from a Jewish perspective. And a Gentile perspective was Western thinking, and Jewish perspective was comfortable with doubt and questioning and wonder and mystery because it's an Eastern perspective. So many of us in the American church have a difficult time comprehending the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. We have a difficult time with the narratives of Jesus because Jesus was a great Jew and rabbi, and with Paul, who was trained as a Jewish leader. We don't make sense of the paradox that they have, and we try to clean it up, and it should not be cleaned up. We should enjoy the mystery and the paradox of what Paul's trying to do. And so as a good Jew, he was trying to wrestle with the reality that Jesus was a Messiah. Not the Messiah that they were longing or hoping for in Judaism at Jesus' time. They were longing for someone to offer some type of military conquest and to just delete out all of their oppressors, which many of us are longing for today. But that is not who Jesus was. Jesus came to sacrifice, to die to himself, to teach us a path of suffering. And so Paul is holding all of these complexities within himself. Paul is figuring out who he is and who Jesus is in the midst of the world that he lives in. And why that's helpful for us, and when we don't try to clean it up, then I think we make parallels to our own culture. That in our culture, even within the United States of America, we have competing values that go together and also work against one another. There's a Venn diagram that happens ideologically within the United States all of the time, where we believe in equality for all, and then we believe in individual rights. They do not always perfectly match up. I do not love the individual rights of people who get to carry semi-automatic weapons at protests. That is a value ideologically within the United States of America that competes against the value of equality for all. Just like I believe that all people, no matter the circumstance, should not be killed by police officers, and other people believe if you come from a quote-unquote bad neighborhood, racism, that somehow it's more likely that it's okay that a police officer shoots you versus somebody in suburbia, which is not okay. These values compete all of the time in some type of Venn diagram. We are regularly living in the complexity of our world, and we feel the tension of it, even if we can't always name it. And Paul was as well. And if we can see that's what Paul's doing, I think that we can engage Paul in the scriptures in a little bit different way. Not only was Paul paradoxical, he was also complicated. I think most of the people who make Paul complicated were reformers. Reformers are the people who came about 500 years ago and reformed away, protested, thus the name Protestants, from the Catholic Church. There was this belief that that system was not working and there needed to be more individual freedoms, right, for people and how they experienced their faith. In the narrative of protesters, it wasn't always the oppressor and the marginalized. A lot of times it was two powerful groups competing against one another. The trouble with that historically, and we live and breathe in these waters, whether we know it or not, is because of people like John Calvin, who created theology and doctrine like Tulip. If you don't know what Tulip is, God bless you. If you do know what Tulip is, I am so sorry. Tulip is this acronym that starts with the T for total depravity. Most of the bad theology that we have today that says human beings are depraved, horrible, rotten creatures that God is so angry at comes from these reformers and the sociology that they were living into in their day. And that theology transforms all the way forward into American evangelicalism, where we believe that the central message of the good news is that Jesus needed to die for you to make God happy because of how bad you were. And I always repeat this because that has not always been the theological lens or the interpretation that we have of the Bible. As I've said in here before, for the first 1,000 years of the church, that is not how we understood the life of Jesus or good news, or thematically what the scriptures were doing. We understood the life of the church with this fancy word called Theosis, which means that we have always been made in the image of God, and that through Jesus and the life of Jesus and the good news of it, we learn to live into the likeness of God. That was the message of the church for 1,000 years. So what happens is, by the way, if you're still keeping up with me, good for you, because this is a lot, right? You're taking notes fast. So what's happening here is that Paul becomes complicated because we put all these layers on Paul. And then what happens is that for those 500 years, the people who were creating those theological lenses happened to be European, white, and the most powerful people that the world has ever seen. And so out of those powerful people comes theology that subjugates other human beings. Out of that theology, we begin to talk about God's sovereignty. Well, now isn't this convenient that God sovereignly chose you, white Europeans, as favored and chosen as saved by God, and now it is your job to go bring that message to all of the other people of the world, which happen to be a very different color than you, and you subjugate them in the name and the blessing of God. That's convenient theology of sovereignty versus how would a theology of theosis have served us well there? Instead of it being, God chose us, look how superior we are, look what we can do for you. What if it was the theology of theosis, which is where the church was for 1,000 years? You are already made in the image of God. We cannot wait as you continue and show us more of the likeness of God, because we need your diversity to show us a bigger image of who God is. Your theology really matters in how you understand the scriptures. So I think Paul is less complicated, but some of us have really messed Paul up. If we can understand that Paul is complicated, I just barely spared an F word right there. I'd use everything in me to really control that, and I need you to know that. And I would like a few claps. You're welcome. So sometimes what we do with Paul, because Paul's complicated, is we make Paul to be the greatest Twitter account that has ever been made. Right? Even greater than the one who sits on his golden throne at 5 a.m. and treats from the White House, shall not be named. But so what happens with Paul is that we take Paul and we give all these like little sound bites for what he's saying. The problem is that Paul is not a Twitter account. So when we tweet things that Paul says, we weaponize it and it becomes incredibly oppressive. Paul never wrote in sound bites. Paul wrote these long, extensive letters that were this continuous strain of thought that is taking you somewhere from beginning to end. So if you just offer a soundbite in the middle of a movie, you can make it say whatever you want. It's a lot harder work to hear the flow, the heart, the energy of where this thing is going. And that's what Paul is always trying to do. Perhaps one of the greatest examples of that is everybody's favorite tract that somebody gave you when you were a kid, Romans 3:23. For all have sinned. Maybe you've heard that one. For all have sinned, right? But no one reads verse 24, and all are freely justified by God's grace. That is so weird that nobody offered us verse 24. If you take the soundbite, for all have sinned, that conveniently supports your theology of oppression and the power that you have to save people. Instead of it being what Paul was doing in the book of Romans, where Paul takes us over this long, beautiful book, is Paul is trying to make the point, he's trying to equalize the fact that we're all sinners. But he's not equalizing the fact that we're all sinners to point out that we're gross or bad. Paul's trying to do that so that Jews don't have a superiority complex to Gentiles. He's trying to do that so that you don't judge. He's trying to say, I know you think you're religious and you've got like Abraham's blood in you and all these things, but you got just as much shit going on as they do. That was Paul's point in Romans. And if you can see that, then you'll humanize them. And when you humanize them, then together you'll experience the grace and wonder of God. What a very different book Romans is all of a sudden. when we don't do sound bites, but when we see the flow and the energy of what Paul is trying to do. By the way, this little fact break, I don't know if you know this, how the Bible is actually put together. For the New Testament, you get the Gospels, they're put together for like certain theological reasons, but for the rest of the letters in the New Testament, they're not put together because God was like Romans first and then Corinthians. No, it's literally just longest to shortest by author. That's it. That's how the New Testament was put together. A librarian did it to help organize it. You have like 16 long, beautiful chapters of Romans, and then you get like all the way down to like 25 verses of Philemon. Philemon fans out there, praise God. You see what I'm saying? The point of that is that the Bible, we make the Bible do all kinds of things it's not trying to do. The Bible's just organized in this specific way just so that you knew who the author was. And so when we engage the scriptures through bad theological lenses that have been given to us, or we try to make the Bible do things that it was never intended to do, we miss the heartbeat and the energy of where it's trying to take us. And so Romans is this powerful book that is trying to lead us towards a broader understanding that every human being gets to experience grace regardless of where they came from. Imagine that type of good news that we could have been living into instead of one that is dominated by judgment and superiority and exclusive complexes. And with that said, I'm going to go fastly some verses. Follow along with me in Galatians chapter 1. It goes like this. Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message I preach is not based on mere human reasoning. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. Again, he's not trying to prove anything here. He's super healthy. You know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, how violently I persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. But even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. Then it pleased him to reveal his son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. Then 14 years later, I went back to Jerusalem again, and this time with Barnabas and Titus came along too, and I went there because God revealed to me that I should go. While I was there, I met privately with those considered to be leaders of the church and shared with them the message I had been preaching to the Gentiles. I wanted to make sure that we were in agreement for fear that all my efforts had been wasted and I was running the race for nothing. Let me put a little bit of context about the verses that we just read. You can go back and read this in Galatians. But Galatians is the first book of the New Testament that we probably have. It was written probably even 15 years before the Gospels, which might sound weird to you. And the book of Galatians is Paul, as a good Jewish rabbi, trying to make sense of the fact that this message of Jesus the Christ is bigger than just Jerusalem. Let me say it this way. Paul never experienced Jesus. Paul experienced the resurrected Christ. Peter, James, John, Mary, they all had stories around the campfire about Jesus and their interaction with who Jesus was. Paul did not, which is valuable. It's like God was saying, we can't just have stories about the life of Jesus, because what will happen is what happens with all human beings. You will experience something, it will work for you, and now you will be so myopic to think that every other human being needs to do the exact same thing that you just did. Have you ever met a human being that tried to work out for the first time and they lost 15 pounds, or they did some Atkins diet and they lost 20 pounds, and now they think that every human being on planet Earth should be a vegan too or something like that? We do it all the time. We're all great proselytizers of ourselves because we know ourselves best. But what Paul does is Paul recognizes, thank God, Peter, James, and John, and Mary, and all of the other original apostles, that you experienced Jesus, that for Paul, as somebody who used to persecute the church, he had a new revelation and experience with Jesus as the resurrected Christ, which is important for all of us, because none of us experienced Jesus in the flesh. We will all be experiencing a resurrected Christ. This is where the story evolves. There's a reason that Paul never shares a story about Jesus, because it wasn't his experience. Paul was trying to provide a framework for you that whoever you are and wherever you are, you would continue to experience the love of God through this resurrected Christ. Which is a way of saying this: whoever you are and wherever you are, if you're a human being, you will go through your own brokenness, your own death, your own crucifixion, metaphorically or literally speaking. And it's in the deepest, darkest places of your life that God shows up, and those are the things that are resurrected. Those are the things that are repaired. Those are the things that are reconciled, and that's the journey that every human being is on. Galatians is this beautiful early work of Paul where he literally says to Peter, you fool, stop trying to get in the way of where this good news is evolving to. News has to get beyond Jerusalem. The good news was never meant just for the Southern Baptist Convention. The good news is for people who don't even speak in tongues. I know. The good news is not even just for Christianity. The good news is for all of humanity, that God accepts you exactly where you're at. And the church, these followers of Christ, we're not people who are excluding or living in the superiority complex of that because something worked for them. They were supposed to be the proclaimers of that reality that you already have good news. God is already with you. Let's talk about how the resurrected Christ has already been in your culture. And that's what some of the earliest Christianity did well. Celtic Christianity, if you want to Google some stuff later. I am going fast and furious today. Let's do this. And so what happens here is that Paul is trying to provide a bigger story of God. Paul is going through his own deconstruction where he is pained at times that he comes from this Jewish tradition, and all that Paul wants in his writings is he longs for his fellow brothers and sisters who are Jewish to see that Jesus was the Christ that they were anticipating. But that this Christ is not just for them and their kosher laws and those who get circumcised, that this Christ is for all human beings. This is the pain and the challenge that Paul goes through. And so Paul reconstructs a narrative about Jesus that needs to move far beyond Jerusalem. And so for you, if you grew up with the Jerusalem, or your church, or a set of ideology, or that town you came from, and you feel like you've grown from that thing, and you feel uncomfortable even sometimes when you go back because your world has expanded and grown. If anyone gives you shit from that church over there, you get to look them squarely in the eye and say, I'm just like Paul. What a win, right? That you're trying to evolve and grow from that thing, and that's what God has always been trying to do. God is trying to expand your understanding of what God is doing in the world. And you need all other human beings' stories and experiences to get us there. And so Paul deconstructs through his own process, reconstructs a new reality that is the truth of the good news that God's grace is for all people. Paul moves us away from all of the Jerusalems that we have, those places in our life that say, you can't ask that or think that, or that's not of God. That's actually not true. This is exactly what the scriptures are doing. And that when you can move through these things, the thing that you'll recognize with Paul is that Paul needed time for these things to live out inside of him. Many of us, we experience something new for the first time. This is a very human thing. And after going to like one protest, we think, I no longer experience white fragility. No, that is not how that works. Or you start posting like you are basically Martin Luther King Jr. No, that is not how that works. But what it is, it's your first movement into something bigger, whatever that thing is. And what Paul shows us, even in the story of Galatians, is he says in here, I experienced this resurrected Christ, and then 3 years happened, and then I finally went and spoke with Peter, James, and John, and then another 14 years happened, and then I finally left Jerusalem. 17 years took place before Paul felt ready to go share this good news, which for us is saying this: maturity is not easy. Maturity will take time. There will be endless moments of deconstructing and reconstructing as you live into this greater reality of who God is. Will it be hard work? Of course it will, but it's good. So be patient with yourself in your journey as you leave your Jerusalems and as you enter into the maturity that God has for you. And as you get more mature, would you realize that the other people who you're so judgmental to now, that they're on their own journeys as well? And would you trust the fact that God allowed you to be a little bit more woke in your story? So could you trust that God will allow them to be woke in their stories as well? Amen. And through your listening, right? Through your compassion, By you being the grown-up, maybe you'll contribute into that narrative instead of developing greater walls that might prevent them from seeing this bigger reality and experience of who God is. This is what Paul invites us into. Paul is constantly evolving. Paul is constantly growing. Paul is constantly telling us a bigger story of who God is. And we all know this as human beings. We all know that we slowly mature over time. I have 3 little kids, and when my kids are young, we begin this practice of getting to cross the street. And you start by carrying your little kid across the street. They're not ready to engage all that is happening on the street in front of you. And then they get a little bit older and they hold your hand and you teach them, look left and look right and look left again and make sure you don't see any cars. Are we good to go? Good, now let's cross the street together. And then over time, you get to this brave moment where they want to go play at their friend's house and you look out your window and you're just terrified, but they cross the street on their own. And then there's the day that they want to get on their bike and they got to go like 2 blocks away, and you know I've secretly got a GPS system attached to that bike, but they don't know it, right? Because I'm living in faith, but not enough. And so they got to go and do their own thing. And then eventually there's going to be a day where you're going to give that child a car and they're going to get on an interstate and go 80 miles per hour because they've learned enough about life to be able to handle the roads as they get bigger. And something that they've learned about life and the maturity that Paul teaches us is you're not ready for some roads yet. Be patient with where you're at. Some of those roads you will eventually get to, but each and every one of those roads have boundaries for you. And those boundaries are there for your health and for your thriving. And then if you are now ready for the interstate, don't believe that every other person in your life is ready to cross the road, because there might be certain areas in life where they're way more advanced than you and you need their experience and their interstate driving. And there's other areas of your life where they need your experience. And Paul gets this. Paul understands that it's complicated. Paul understands that it's paradoxical. Paul understands that it's complicated. And if we can understand that, how might that allow us to live maturely in the world as we evolve and as we grow up? That's the story of Paul. That's where Scripture is leading us. And it's always leading us back to its core message, that as we mature, now we become the greatest storytellers of this good news, that you have always been God's child, that you have always been loved, and that God has always enjoyed you. That's the work that we have, New Abbey. And with that, let's go answer some questions in a group together. Where is your evolution leading to maturity? Enjoy.